I'm 68 years old now, and for 42 years I've been keeping the biggest secret imaginable. In the back of my property, hidden among the mountains of West Virginia, lives an entire family of Bigfoots. Not just one, but 5 of them. And what I learned observing these creatures over 4 decades completely changed my view of who the real monster is in this story. My name is Thomas Brennan, and this is the story of how I became the only human being to witness the intimate life of a Bigfoot family, and why what I discovered about them made me question everything about our own humanity. Before we continue, if you enjoy extraordinary stories that challenge everything we think we know about the world, leave your like on this video and subscribe to the channel. This helps me continue bringing these incredible stories to you. And turn on notifications so you don't miss any uploads. May 1983. I was 26 years old and had just inherited my grandfather's property, 200 acres of dense forest in the Appalachian Mountains. It was an isolated place. My nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, perfect for someone like me, seeking solitude after years working in Pittsburgh. The property had a wooden house built in the 1940s, a dilapidated barn, and miles of virgin forest that probably hadn't seen human presence in decades. My grandfather, William Brennan, had been a peculiar man. He lived on that property for 45 years, rarely going to town, rarely receiving visitors. My family always thought he was just eccentric, a hermit who preferred trees to people. But when I spent the first week exploring the property after his death, I found strange things. A diary hidden in a metal box, buried under the barn floor. The entries were cryptic, talking about nighttime visitors, gifts left at the forest edge, eyes glowing in the darkness. The last entry, dated 3 days before his death in January 1983, said only, "They know I'm leaving. They brought flowers. I cried like a child. May God protect whoever comes after me. May they have the wisdom to see what I saw." At the time, I thought they were the delusions of an old man, but I kept the diary. In the 3rd week living there, I began to notice strange things. Piles of firewood I organized appeared disarranged in the morning, enormous footprints in the mud near the creek, sounds at night that didn't resemble any animal I knew, deep vocalizations, almost human, echoing through the trees when the sun set. At first I thought of bears. The Appalachian Mountains have many of them, but the footprints were different. 5 toes like human hands and feet, only 3 times larger. And bears don't stack stones in geometric formations, which I found in 3 different locations on the property. They were perfect circles of stones, with a larger stone in the center, like some kind of marker or monument. I also found offerings. There's no other word to describe it. Carefully arranged piles of pine cones, wildflowers, branches arranged in patterns, always in the same places, always replaced if I moved them. On June 3rd, 1983, everything changed. I was cutting firewood near the eastern edge of the property when I heard something that froze my blood. A scream, not from an animal, not exactly human. Something in between, a scream of pain and desperation that cut through the afternoon air like a blade. I grabbed my rifle and followed the sound. I walked about a quarter mile into the forest until I found a ravine I hadn't yet explored. And there, trapped between 2 rocks at the bottom of the ravine, was her, a female Bigfoot, about 6.5 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown hair. Her left leg was trapped horribly, the bone clearly broken, exposed through the skin. She was conscious, looking at me with eyes that expressed absolute terror, but that wasn't all. Clutched to her chest, trembling, was an infant, no bigger than a 3-year-old human child, with enormous frightened eyes, clinging to its mother as if life depended on it. I lowered my weapon slowly. The creature watched me, her eyes following every movement. There was no aggression in that look, only fear, pain, and something more, pleading. She was asking me for help, and then I noticed something extraordinary. She was holding something in her free hand. It took me a moment to recognize it. It was a photo, old and faded, protected in thick plastic tied with cord. When I looked closer, my heart almost stopped. It was a photo of my grandfather. He was standing next to the barn, smiling, and beside him, partially obscured by shadows but unmistakable, was an enormous hairy silhouette. She knew my grandfather. She had come here because she knew this property, because she knew it was safe, and she had fallen into that ravine while trying to reach the house. "It's okay," I whispered, though I didn't know if she could understand me. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'll try to help. My grandfather was your friend, wasn't he? I will be too." When I mentioned my grandfather, she reacted. Her eyes widened, and she made a soft, almost questioning sound. Then she pointed at the photo, then at me, then back at the photo. "Yes," I said, nodding vigorously. "William, my grandfather. He was my grandfather." She closed her eyes, and tears, real tears, rolled down her hairy face. She was relieved. It took me 3 hours to free her. I climbed down into the ravine with ropes, tools, and a first aid kit I knew was totally inadequate for the situation. The female didn't try to attack me once. She just watched, holding her infant, allowing me to work to move the rocks that imprisoned her leg. When I finally freed her, she tried to stand and immediately collapsed. The leg was broken in at least 2 places. She wouldn't be able to walk, wouldn't be able to hunt, wouldn't be able to survive. And that's when I heard other sounds. Heavy movements in the forest above the ravine, branches breaking, and then he appeared. An enormous male, easily 8 feet tall, shoulders as broad as a door. His fur was almost black, graying around the face, and he was looking directly at me, standing beside his injured mate. My heart almost stopped. This was the moment. If he wanted to kill me, there would be nothing I could do, but he didn't attack. He looked at me, then at the female, then back at me. And then he did something extraordinary. He pointed at her, then pointed at himself, then pointed at me, and then put his enormous hands together as if pleading. He was asking me for help. An 8-foot Bigfoot was asking me to help his family. "She can't walk," I said, my voice trembling. "The leg is badly hurt. She needs a place to recover, food, water, time." The male tilted his head, clearly processing my words. Then he looked around the ravine, then back at me. He made a gesture, as if carrying something, pointing in the direction of my house. "You want me to take them to my property?" I asked, barely believing I was having this conversation. He nodded, a clear, deliberate human nod. Then he did something more. He picked up a stick from the ground and began to draw in the dirt. Simple lines, but unmistakable. A square with a triangular roof, my house. Then a larger rectangle, the barn. He'd been there before. He knew the property. "You knew my grandfather too," I said, understanding flooding over me. "You all knew him." The male stopped drawing and looked at me. Then he placed his enormous hand over his heart and made a deep, sad sound. Mourning. He was mourning my grandfather. "He was my friend too," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm sorry for your loss. I'll help you. I'll do what he would do." That's how the family came to live with me. It took me the rest of that day and all night to help the male transport the injured female and the infant back to my property. I cleaned out the barn, which had a large private loft. I brought hay, blankets, water. I used improvised splints and bandages on her leg, knowing it was the best I could do. The male stayed with me that first day, watching everything I did. When night fell and I brought food, venison from my freezer and fresh vegetables from my garden, he ate gratefully, but he never took his eyes off me. He was evaluating whether I was trustworthy. That first night, after they had eaten and the female was resting as comfortably as possible, the male approached me. He was holding something in his hand. When he opened it, I saw it was a locket I recognized because I'd seen photos of it around my grandfather's neck in old family photographs. "He gave this to you," I whispered, taking the locket with trembling hands. "My grandfather gave this to you." The male nodded, then gently placed it in my hand and closed my fingers around it. He was passing on a responsibility, a trust that had been established decades before. I opened the locket. Inside were 2 tiny photos. One was of my grandmother, who died before I was born. The other, surprisingly, was of the male Bigfoot, younger, the fur less gray. My grandfather had carried a photo of him. They weren't just acquaintances, they were close friends. "I'll take care of you," I promised, just like he did. "You're safe here." In the first weeks, we established a routine. I would bring food and water twice a day. I'd check the female's leg, change the bandages. The infant, whom I began calling Little Ben, gradually lost his fear of me. He was curious, touching my tool, watching while I worked. The male, whom I called Magnus due to his size, began communicating with me in increasingly sophisticated ways. He used gestures, facial expressions, different vocalization. Within a month, we had developed a basic communication system. A low growl meant danger. A soft sound meant gratitude. Pointing combined with different expressions conveyed specific needs. But Magnus also showed me that they had a much more complex language among themselves. I would hear them at night, vocalizing in elaborate patterns that clearly had meaning. They weren't just random grunts. They were conversations, discussions, stories. One night, about 3 weeks after they arrived, Magnus sat me down and began deliberately teaching me. He would point at objects and make specific sounds. Tree, water, food, danger, friend, family. He was teaching me their language. I spent months learning. It was difficult. My mouth and throat couldn't make many of the sounds they made naturally, but I managed to learn enough for basic communication. And combined with gestures, we developed a way to actually converse. The female, whom I named Aurora because of the reddish tones in her fur, took 3 months to recover enough to walk. During this time, I observed things about them that no human had ever witnessed. They were incredibly intelligent. Magnus could solve complex problems. When I accidentally locked the barn door one day, he studied the mechanism for 10 minutes and then used a stick to unlock it. Aurora taught little Ben constantly, showing him how to peel fruit, how to test if something was safe to eat, how to recognize poisonous versus edible plants. They had complex emotions. I saw Aurora cry, real tears rolling down her face, when little Ben got hurt, falling from a beam. I saw Magnus laugh, a deep, thunderous sound, when little Ben tried to imitate my movements and fell on his butt. They had culture. Aurora sang to little Ben at night, melodic vocalizations that seemed like lullabies. Magnus created simple tools, sharpened sticks to get food from difficult places, flat stones used as plates. They had rituals. Every morning at sunrise, Magnus and Aurora would face east and make a specific harmonic vocalization. It was a prayer, I realized, or something very much like one. And they had morality. When little Ben once took extra food without permission, Magnus reprimanded him, not violently but firmly, until little Ben put the food back and made a sound that clearly meant sorry. They had stories. Magnus would spend entire nights vocalizing to little Ben, clearly telling stories. I'd catch occasional words I had learned: mountain, ancients, humans, danger, but mostly hidden. Secret, survive. He was teaching little Ben the history of his people, how they survived by staying hidden, how they avoided humans, how my grandfather had been the only exception in generations. One night, I used my limited language and gestures to ask Magnus about this. Why trust humans now? Why risk it? Magnus thought for a long time. Then he began telling a story, speaking slowly so I could understand, using gestures to fill in the gaps. Decades ago, he said, when he was young like little Ben is now, there was a great hunt. Humans with guns and dogs came to the mountains. They were specifically looking for Bigfoots. Someone had taken a photo, proven they existed. The government wanted specimens. They wanted to capture them, study them. Magnus's family fled deeper into the mountains, but Magnus's mother was sick, couldn't move fast. The dogs found them. The humans surrounded them. Magnus, then just a teenager, thought they were going to die. But then a different human arrived, an old man with white hair and kind eyes. He placed himself between the hunters and Magnus's family. He yelled at the other humans, told them to go away. There was an argument. Guns were pointed, but the old man didn't move. He protected Magnus's family with his own body. Eventually the hunters left, and the old man, my grandfather, helped Magnus's family hide on his property until it was safe. He treated Magnus's sick mother, brought them food, never told anyone. For 40 years, Magnus said, the old man kept the secret. 40 years of friendship, 40 years of trust. When the old man died, Magnus came to the funeral, hidden in the trees, watching from afar. He saw me there, saw the old man's grandson crying. And when Aurora got hurt near the property months later, Magnus remembered the kindness, remembered the protection, and gambled that the old man's grandson might be like him. Hearing this made me cry. My grandfather, whom my family always thought was a strange, eccentric old man, had been a hero. He had risked everything to protect an entire species. I'll be like him, I promised Magnus that night. I'll protect you just like he did, no matter what it costs. In September 1983, Aurora was fully recovered. I knew they would probably leave, return to the depths of the forest. But they didn't go. Magnus and Aurora had a long exchange of vocalizations one night, and then Magnus came to me. He placed his hand on his chest, then pointed to the forest. Then he pointed to the barn, to me, and placed both hands over his heart. "You want to stay," I said, understanding. "You feel safe here." Magnus nodded, and then did something that made me cry. He extended his enormous hand to me, an offer of a handshake, an acknowledgement of friendship. I shook his hand, and in that moment, my life changed forever. The following years were extraordinary. The family remained in the barn, but I built a series of structures connected by covered tunnels, allowing them to move without being seen. I created a 1-acre fenced space in the densest forest where they could be outdoors at night without risk of being discovered. I installed running water systems in the barn, built an indoor fireplace with proper ventilation so they could cook, insulated the walls so they could stay warm in winter, essentially transformed the barn into a comfortable home, albeit hidden. In 1985, Aurora gave birth to another infant, a female I called Luna. Witnessing the birth was one of the most extraordinary moments of my life. Aurora was in labor for hours, and Magnus was clearly worried. He asked me to stay, to help if something went wrong, but it didn't. Luna was born healthy, a perfect little hairy being who cried exactly like a human baby. Aurora held her, tears of joy rolling down her face, while Magnus stood beside them, his expression of pure happiness and relief. Little Ben, now about 5 years old, was fascinated with his little sister. He touched her gently, making soft sounds of admiration. From day one, he was a protective and caring brother. Seeing that family grow, seeing the love they shared, made it impossible to think of them as animals. They were people, different from us biologically, but people in every way that matters. In 1988, another male was born, whom I named Atlas. Magnus now had 3 children, and the family of 5 occupied all the space I had created. The children played like human children play, chasing each other, hiding, creating games. Aurora and Magnus educated them with patience and love, teaching survival skills, language, history. But there were also challenges. Feeding 5 Bigfoots required increasingly more resources. I had to be incredibly careful not to raise suspicions in town when buying groceries. I started hunting more seriously, fished regularly, expanded my garden every year. I told people I was selling produce, which explained why I bought so many seeds and supplies. In 1988, another infant was born, a male I named Atlas for his strength even as a baby. Watching those children grow was like witnessing the evolution of humanity itself. Each infant was unique. Little Ben was adventurous and curious, always exploring, always asking questions through vocalizations and gestures. Luna was gentle and empathetic, always the first to notice if someone was sad or hurt. Atlas was playful and mischievous, constantly creating games and trying to make others laugh. Magnus taught me survival skills that no book could teach. How to read trails days old, identifying not just what animal passed, but its size, health, where it was going. How to predict weather by observing bird behavior, the color of the sky at sunset, the feel of the wind. How to find water in any terrain, following indicator plants and rock formation. Aurora taught me about plants. She knew hundreds of species, which were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous. She had knowledge accumulated over generations of her species, knowledge that was disappearing as her people dwindled in number and were forced into smaller and smaller areas. She showed me plants that could treat wounds, reduce fever, relieve pain, plants that could be woven into strong ropes, plants whose roots could be made into soap. It was a complete PhD in survival botany, taught by someone whose life literally depended on this knowledge. But the most important thing I learned wasn't about survival skills or forest knowledge. It was about humanity, or the lack of it. In 1991, illegal hunters invaded my property. I confronted them 100 yards from the barn. They were looking for bears, they said. I drove them off with my rifle, but that night Magnus came to me with something in his hands, an ID card that one of the hunters had dropped. They weren't just hunters. They were researchers from a university with government authorization to collect biological samples from large mammals. They had tranquilizer darts, capture equipment. They were looking for Bigfoots. I researched the name on the card. Dr. Richard Havison, a cryptozoologist with 3 published papers on Bigfoot sightings in the Appalachians. He was actively searching for them and had federal authorization to capture live specimens for study. That night, I showed the card to Magnus. He looked at it for a long time, then looked at his infants playing in the corner of the barn. Then he looked at me and made a gesture I'll remember forever. He placed a hand around his neck, mimicking a collar, and then pointed at his infants. Then he shook his head violently. No, never. He understood. If they were discovered, they wouldn't be treated as people. They would be treated as animals. Specimens. Scientific property. Their children would grow up in cages, studied, exhibited, perhaps dissected when they died. I'll keep you safe, I promised. They'll never find you. Never. I spent the next decade increasingly paranoid. I installed security cameras around the entire property, built barriers that looked natural but would alert me if anyone crossed, bought adjacent land whenever it became available, creating a buffer zone of nearly 1,000 acres around the core of the property where the family lived. I studied property law, trespass rights, protections against search and seizure, consulted lawyers about how to protect my property from government searches, creating narratives about endangered plant species I was protecting. I created layers of legal protection that would make it extremely difficult for anyone to obtain legal access to my land. But I also knew that if someone really wanted to, they could invade, could use satellites, drones, thermal imaging technology. As technology advanced, keeping the family hidden became increasingly difficult. In 1995, we almost lost everything. A forest fire started 9 miles away, spreading rapidly due to severe drought. Evacuation orders were issued. Law enforcement went door to door, ensuring everyone left. I couldn't evacuate, couldn't leave the family. But I also couldn't explain why I was staying. I told the officers I had valuable livestock I couldn't move quickly. They gave me a stern warning and left, saying they wouldn't be responsible if anything happened to me. I spent 3 terrifying days preparing the property, created fire lines, clearing vegetation in wide swaths around the buildings, filled every possible container with water, constantly wetted the roofs, and kept Magnus and his family ready to flee at any moment if the fire got too close. The fire came within half a mile. The sky turned black with smoke. Ash fell like snow. The children were terrified, never having seen anything like it. Aurora held them, singing softly, trying to keep them calm. Magnus stood beside me on the barn roof, watching the fire approach, ready to grab his family and run if necessary, but reluctant to leave the only safe place they knew. Then, miraculously, the wind changed. The fire turned east, away from us, eventually being contained by firefighting crews 3 miles away. We were saved. When it was all over, and officers returned to check the property, they were amazed I had survived. Called me lucky. Stupid but lucky. I didn't tell them it wasn't luck, it was desperation. I would have died protecting that family. Magnus knew this. That night, after the danger passed, he placed his hand on my shoulder and looked into my eyes for a long time. Then he made a gesture I'd seen Aurora make with her children 1,000 times. He placed his hand over my heart, then over his own. Then he hugged me. It was the first time he had hugged me, and in that embrace I felt decades of trust, friendship, and love. We weren't just protector and protected. We were family. In 1997, Magnus became ill. He was in his 50s, I estimated, old for his species. Aurora cared for him constantly, bringing medicinal plants she knew, keeping him warm. The infants, now teenagers, stayed close, clearly worried. I brought a veterinarian, a longtime friend named Dr. Sarah Chen, who swore secrecy after I invented a story about having an illegal exotic gorilla. She was skeptical, but needed the money, and I was paying well. When she saw Magnus, she literally froze. For a full minute, she just stared, mouth open, unable to process what she was seeing. Then she whispered, "This isn't possible." "It's possible, and he's dying," I said. "Can you help him?" To her credit, Sarah pulled herself together quickly. She was a professional. She examined Magnus thoroughly, while he lay patiently, trusting that I wouldn't bring someone who would hurt him. Pneumonia, she finally diagnosed. Severe, but treatable. He needs antibiotics, rest, and supportive care. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah visited daily. She treated Magnus, but also did something else. She talked to me, asked questions about everything: how long they'd been here, how I communicate with them, what they eat, how they behave. "Thomas," she said one evening, "do you understand what you have here? It's not just a Bigfoot, it's an entire family. This would change everything. Everything we think we know about primates, about human evolution, about our own history. That's why it can't be revealed," I replied. "You saw how they are. Intelligent, loving people with culture and family. If the world knew, they'd be treated as specimens, captured, studied, exploited." Sarah argued with me for days. As a scientist, she said, she had an obligation to share this knowledge. But as a human, she saw my point, saw the family interact, saw the love between them, saw how Magnus looked at his children. Finally, she agreed to keep the secret, but she made one condition. She wanted to document everything: measurements, behavioral observations, DNA samples. Not to publish, but to preserve. In case something happened, in case they were discovered, this documentation could help protect them, prove they were more than animals. I agreed, and Magnus also agreed when I explained through our communication system. He understood that Sarah was trying to help. Magnus recovered, but the incident scared me. They were mortal, they aged, they would die, and I wasn't getting any younger either. I was 40 in 1997. What would happen to them when I was no longer there? I began documenting everything, kept detailed journals about their behaviors, their language, their social structure, took photographs carefully stored in fireproof safes, collected hair samples with their consent, storing them for possible future analysis. But I also began thinking about contingencies. Wrote a will leaving the property to a foundation I created, with specific instructions about wildlife maintenance, established trust funds that would continue to pay for the property and supplies for decades after my death. I talked to Magnus about this, explained as best I could with our limited language that I was mortal, that eventually I wouldn't be here anymore, that he would need to protect his family without me. Magnus understood, and he was worried. He knew his people were dwindling, that there were fewer and fewer of them each generation, that their world was shrinking while ours expanded. But the most important thing I documented was this: over 15 years living with them, they were never violent. Not once. Not with each other, not with me, not with any animal except prey for food. When little Ben once found an injured raccoon, he brought it to Aurora, who treated and cared for it until it could survive on its own. They had no concept of war, no concept of greed. They shared everything equally, resolved conflicts through vocalizations and gestures, never with violence, taught their children with infinite patience, never with harsh punishment. They were, in every way that matters, more human than most humans I've known. The 2000s brought new challenges. The internet meant more people could share sightings. Drones became common, and I lived in fear that someone would fly over my property and see something. Cell phones with cameras meant any accidental hiker could instantly document what they saw. I had to adapt continuously, planted more trees to block aerial view, installed signal jamming equipment in critical areas, monitored online forums and Bigfoot watcher groups, always alert for any mention of my area. In 2001, there was a sighting reported just 5 miles away. A camping family claimed to have seen an enormous hairy creature near their campsite. The story spread quickly online, and within days the area was flooded with Bigfoot hunters with cameras and tracking equipment. I knew it wasn't my family. They never went that far, but still, it terrified me. The increased attention meant more people in the forests, more chances of someone stumbling onto my property. I talked to Magnus about this. He explained that there were other families, but they were distant and rare. They communicated occasionally through vocalizations that carried for miles, but rarely met. It was too dangerous to gather in large groups, made them easier to detect. There were maybe 30, maybe 40 of his species remaining in the Appalachian Mountains. Magnus estimated through our communication system. We used stones to count. Once there had been hundreds, but human development, hunting, disease, everything had reduced their numbers. They were disappearing, and no one but me knew. In 2003, I had to make a difficult decision. Little Ben, now 20 years old and fully grown, an imposing male of 7.5 feet, wanted to explore. He was restless, spending hours looking at the mountains beyond the property. Magnus and Aurora were worried, but also understood. He needed more than that limited space could offer. He needed to find a mate, needed to live. I spent 3 months training little Ben on how to avoid humans, how to recognize trail cameras by the small lens reflection, by the plastic smell, how to detect people miles away using hearing and smell, how to read signs of recent human activity, fresh footprints, broken branches, the smell of campfires, how to move only at night in areas where humans might be. I taught him about dogs, how they would track his scent, how to confuse them by walking in streams or through areas with strong smells, about cars and roads, how sound carried, and how to avoid being caught in headlights. Magnus also trained him, sharing ancestral knowledge about how his people survived for millennia, where to find shelter, which areas to avoid, how to recognize signs left by others of his species. When he finally left on a September night in 2003, Magnus and Aurora stood at the edge of the property, watching until he disappeared into the darkness. Aurora cried, deep anguished sounds that broke my heart. Magnus stood in that spot until dawn, motionless, a father letting his son go into a dangerous world. I cried too. I'd known little Ben since he was a baby, helped raise him, taught him things, learned from him, and now he was out there alone in a world that would hunt him if it knew he existed. He returned 3 weeks later, but he had changed. There was a new confidence in him, a new maturity. He had seen the world beyond the safety fences I had created, had seen development, roads, people, and he brought news. Through elaborate vocalizations and gestures, little Ben told his story. He had traveled 30 miles north to remote areas I had never visited, and there he found others, a small family, an older couple with a teenage daughter. They lived in a deep cave, coming out only at night. They were afraid, hungry, barely surviving. Development of a new resort nearby had destroyed their traditional foraging areas. They were being pushed into smaller and smaller areas. Little Ben had shared food with them, had stayed and hunted with the male, helping them find new places to forage. And the daughter, well, he was embarrassed when Magnus asked direct questions, but it was clear he had taken an interest in her. Magnus and I had a long conversation that night through our system of gestures and limited vocalizations. He wanted to know if I could help the other family too, if there was room on my property for more. There wasn't. 5 was already pushing the limits of what I could hide and feed. 7 or more would be impossible to keep secret, but I could help in other ways. Over the following months, I made hikes to the remote areas where the other family lived, left large quantities of well-hidden food in locations little Ben showed me. I didn't meet them personally. They were too cautious, but the food always disappeared. I also began doing something else. I began buying land in that area through shell companies, preventing development. It cost me almost all my savings, but it was worth it. Protecting 2 families was better than one. In 2008, Luna fell in love. She had met a young male from another family during one of her nighttime explorations. Magnus and Aurora were divided. They were happy for her. Their people needed every breeding pair they could have, but they were heartbroken at the idea of her leaving. Luna was gentle and empathetic, always the first to notice if someone was sad. She would come to me when I was having difficult days, sit quietly beside me, her presence comforting. She had been my special connection to the family, the way little Ben was with Magnus. She left in April 2009, joining her mate's family in a remote part of West Virginia. Before going, she hugged me. It was the most surprising thing. She was usually shy about physical contact, but she leaned in and wrapped her long arms around me, gently, carefully. Then she vocalized something that took me a moment to recognize. Tom, father. She was calling me father. I cried uncontrollably after she left. The barn house seemed empty without her. Aurora withdrew for weeks, singing softly the lullabies she used to sing to Luna. Atlas stayed until 2012. He was the playful one, always trying to make everyone laugh, But he also needed to leave, needed to find his own family, his own mate. When he left, he took a piece of my heart too. Suddenly, after almost 30 years of a full house, it was just Magnus, Aurora, and me. The property seemed huge and empty. The nighttime vocalizations were quieter. The barn had too much space. Magnus was aging visibly now. His fur was almost completely grey. He moved more slowly, slept more. His appetite had decreased. Aurora was also aging, her movements more careful, her vision not as sharp as before. She confused objects in the distance, something that had never happened before. I was in my 50s, dealing with my own aches and limitations. My knee that I injured years before ached constantly. My back wasn't what it used to be. I climbed stairs more slowly, got tired more easily. We were 3 elderly friends, reaching the end of our lives together. Sarah continued visiting regularly, checking on all of us. She had become part of the family too, the only other human who knew the secret. She saw what was happening. We were all aging. One day in December 2014, she sat with me on the porch after examining Magnus. "Thomas," she said quietly, "he doesn't have much time. Maybe a year, maybe less." "I know," I replied. "I've seen it happening." "And you?" she asked. "How are you? When was the last time you went to a doctor?" "I don't go to doctors," I said. "Can't risk being away for too long. What if something happens while I'm gone?" "Thomas, you need to take care of yourself too," Sarah insisted. "What will happen to them if you fall ill? If you die before Magnus?" I had thought about it. Many sleepless nights thinking about it. I would have to bring someone else into the secret eventually. Would have to find someone who could take over when I couldn't anymore. But who do you trust with something like this? How do you evaluate if someone will put the needs of a Bigfoot family above fame, money, scientific ambition? In 2015, Magnus became gravely ill. This time, it wasn't something antibiotics could cure. Sarah ran tests, took blood samples for analysis at a lab where she had contacts. It was cancer, she confirmed, probably in the liver, spreading. She gave me 6 months, maybe a year if we were lucky. Magnus knew he was dying. He gathered his family. Somehow, using vocalizations that carried for dozens of miles, he sent signals I don't fully understand. And within a week, little Ben came. Then Luna with her mate and 2 small infants. Then Atlas with his mate. Suddenly, there were 11 Bigfoots on the property. It was risky, so risky, but Magnus was dying, and the family needed to be together. It was the only time they risked such a large gathering, but Magnus was dying, and the family needed to be together. I spent that summer observing something remarkable. The family cared for Magnus with a devotion that made me cry. They took turns sitting with him, brought him his favorite food, though he ate little, told him stories, long, elaborate vocalizations that made him smile weakly. Aurora never left his side, holding his hand, singing softly to him. Sometimes I'd see them simply sitting together in silence, forehead to forehead, sharing something too deep for words. The grandchildren he'd never known played quietly around him. Magnus watched them with eyes full of love and contentment. His species was surviving. His children had found mates, had had their own children. The line would continue. One night, about a week before he died, Magnus asked me to sit with him. He was weak, barely able to move, but his mind was still clear. Through gestures and our limited language, he told me something he'd never shared before. He told me about his people, about their history. Thousands of years ago, he said, there were many of his people. They lived throughout North America, from the coastal forests to the Great Plains. They had their own culture, their own stories, their own territories. But then the humans came, first in small numbers. Living alongside Magnus's people, there was peace, occasionally even friendship. Some stories spoke of interbreeding between the species, though that was rare, but then more humans came, and more. And they brought things Magnus's people didn't understand. Diseases that killed quickly, weapons that could kill from far away, and an infinite need to expand, build, possess. Magnus's people retreated, moving to more remote places, but humans always followed, always needed more land, more resources, more space. Over generations, Magnus's people dwindled. Disease, hunting, habitat loss, inbreeding due to lack of mates. Now they were small, scattered groups, hidden, barely surviving. Magnus estimated there were maybe 100 of his people remaining in all of North America, maybe less. They were disappearing. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. Magnus placed his hand over my heart. Then he made complex gestures, using every word I'd learned over the years, working hard to make me understand. "You show humans can be good," he said. "Like the old one. Like Sarah. Some humans can love, protect, keep secret. When I go, you tell story, not where, not how to find, but that we exist, that we think, that we feel, that we are people. You want me to tell the world?" I asked, shocked. Magnus nodded. "After I go, after Aurora go, after you safe, tell story, make humans understand, make humans protect, not hunt, protect." It was an order. No. It was more than that. It was a dying friend's request, a testament. "I'll tell," I promised. "I'll make people understand. I'll protect them, even after you're gone." Magnus smiled, a tired but satisfied smile. Then he made one final gesture. He placed his hand over his heart, then pointed at me. "Love, gratitude, friendship." Magnus died on October 4th, 2015, with Aurora holding one hand and me holding the other. His final moments were peaceful. He looked at Aurora, touched her face gently, one last gesture of love after decades together. Then he looked at me and made one last gesture, hand over heart, pointing at me. "Thank you," I whispered, tears streaming down my face, "for trusting me, for teaching me what really matters, for showing me that family isn't about species, it's about love." He made a soft sound, almost like a sigh, and then he was gone. The barn fell into absolute silence. Then Aurora began to sing, a low, haunting vocalization that rose and fell in tones I'd never heard. It was a funeral song, I realized, a song of farewell. One by one, the others joined in. Little Ben, Luna, Atlas, even the small infants made soft sounds. The song filled the barn, leaked into the night, echoed through the mountains. It was the most beautiful and saddest thing I'd ever heard. The family held a funeral. I didn't know Bigfoots had funerals, but they do. They performed complex rituals that clearly had centuries of tradition. They carried Magnus's body to a deep part of the forest, a sacred place they had used for generations. It was an area I'd never seen, deep on the property, where enormous stones were arranged in patterns. There were other stone mounds there, I realized, others of their people, buried over generations. They placed Magnus on elevated ground and covered him with stones, creating a mound that would last centuries. Each family member placed something on the mound: flowers, special stones. Little Ben placed a tool Magnus had taught him to make as a child, a carefully sharpened stick that Magnus had kept all these years. Luna placed an eagle feather Magnus had given her when she was small, teaching her about the sky. They stood around the mound and sang, deep harmonic vocalizations that echoed through the mountains. They weren't of sadness exactly. They were of honor, memory, celebration of a life well lived. I placed my own offering, the locket Magnus had given me years ago, my grandfather's locket. I placed it on the mound and said my goodbyes. "You were my friend, my teacher, my family," I said, my voice breaking. "You showed me that humanity isn't about species. It's about choices. You taught me to be a better person. I'll miss you every day for the rest of my life." After the funeral, the family left. They couldn't stay. It was too risky to have so many in one place for so long. But before going, each one came to me. Little Ben, now in his 30s with his own infants, placed a hand on my shoulder. His expression was of deep gratitude. He had grown up in safety because of me, had learned to survive, now had his own family. He placed my hand on the head of his oldest infant, a gesture of absolute trust. Luna hugged me, the longest farewell embrace. She cried, her shoulders shaking. She had lost her father and was leaving the only other father she knew. "Tom," she vocalized. "Father. Love." Atlas gave me a respectful nod, then did something surprising. He placed his hand over my heart, then over his own, then pointed at the mound where Magnus was buried. He was saying that part of Magnus would live in me, that I would carry his memory. And Aurora, she stayed longer than everyone. She didn't want to leave the place where Magnus had lived for 32 years, didn't want to leave without him. She and I sat in the barn all night that last night. We looked at the empty space, full of memories. I remembered the first time I saw her, trapped and injured. I remembered Magnus asking me to help. I remembered 32 years of friendship, trust, love. Aurora took my hand, so gently, aware that her fingers could crush mine if she wasn't careful. And then she did something that broke my heart and filled it at the same time. She vocalized, working hard to form sounds her anatomy wasn't made to produce. Tom, friend, family. Always. 32 years of communication through gestures and sounds, and in her final farewell, she found a way to say in words what she had always said in actions. Yes, I cried. Friend, family, forever. I'll keep you safe. I'll tell Magnus's story. I'll make people understand. She nodded, squeezed my hand once, and then left for the forest to join her children. I watched her go, her silhouette disappearing into the trees, and I felt as if a part of me went with her. That was in October 2015. In the years since, I've lived alone again. The barn is empty now, but I don't have the heart to change anything. The space where Magnus used to sleep still has his blanket. The area where the children played still has some of their favorite tools. Sarah continues visiting, checking on me, making sure I'm taking care of myself. She's helping me compile all the documentation, organizing decades of notes and observations. But I still see signs of the family, occasional footprints near the creek, piles of stones left in patterns I recognize, their way of saying hello, we're here. We remember. Sometimes at night, I hear distant vocalizations in the mountains. I believe it's them letting me know they're still there, still safe, still remembering. I keep food at specific points in the forest. It's always gone in the morning. I leave tools and supplies, blankets and basic medicines in remote areas where I know they go. They also disappear. Once a month, I walk to the mound where Magnus is buried. I sit there for hours, talking to him, telling him about my life, about what I'm doing to protect his family. I always leave something new, flowers, a tool I made, an interesting stone, and always there are new offerings from others, feathers, carefully arranged branches, fresh flowers. They still come to visit him, still honor his memory. I'm 68 years old now. My health is failing more noticeably. I had another cardiac scare last year. My knee finally needed surgery. Sarah says I probably have another 10 years, maybe less. And I face the question that has bothered me for 2 decades. What to do with the knowledge I have. I've documented an entire species. I have proof of their existence, their intelligence, their culture. I have DNA evidence that would prove beyond any doubt that they're real. I have 42 years of behavioral records that would revolutionize anthropology, biology, our understanding of human evolution. Sarah and I spent months debating. She argues that revealing what we know could lead to legal protections, endangered species, protected sanctuaries, funding for conservation. But I see the other side. I've seen how humans treat endangered animals, captive breeding programs, tracking collars, restricted habitats. Even with the best intentions, it would be taking away their freedom. And with the worst intentions, hunters, collectors, people who would see them as trophies or curiosities, it would be even worse. But if I reveal what I know, what will happen to them? Will they be protected or hunted, studied or exploited, treated as people or as property? So I made a compromise. These recordings, this story, I'm leaving them in trust with Sarah and a lawyer I trust to be released 50 years after my death. Enough time for any family member I knew to have passed. Enough time for future generations to perhaps be wiser than ours. But I'll withhold specific locations. I'll keep the property details vague enough that they can't be tracked. I'll protect their privacy even after my death, just as I promised Magnus that first night in 1983. What did I learn from them in 42 years? I learned that intelligence isn't exclusive to humans. I learned that emotion, morality, love, and family exist beyond our own species. I learned that what makes us human isn't our biology, but our choices. And the most human choice, the most moral, the most compassionate choice we can make is sometimes to let others live their lives without our interference, without our need to know, catalog, study, and possess everything we encounter. Magnus and his family taught me more about humanity than any human being ever taught. They showed me that kindness, patience, and compassion are universal. That family is more than biology. That friendship can cross even the boundaries of species. They also showed me that we, humans, are simultaneously capable of great beauty and great destruction, that our intelligence gives us power, but not wisdom. That our technology gave us dominion over the earth, but didn't give us the right to dominate it. In the mountains of West Virginia, in forests that are shrinking every year, lives a species that deserves better than what we've given them, deserves better than invasion, study, capture, deserves the same thing we all deserve, the right to exist, to live their lives without fear, to raise their children in peace. I fed a Bigfoot family for 42 years, but they fed me back, not with food, but with wisdom, love, purpose. And what they revealed to me about humanity is this: we're not the only ones capable of thought, of emotion, of love. We're just the only ones arrogant enough to think we are. We're the only ones who think intelligence gives us the right to dominate other species, the only ones who confuse power with superiority, the only ones who destroy other creatures' homes and then wonder why they're disappearing. Magnus taught me that being truly human means recognizing humanity in others, even when they don't look like us, means choosing compassion over curiosity, protection over possession, silence over fame. If you got one thing from this story, let it be this: there are mysteries in this world that deserve to remain mysteries. There are creatures in these forests that deserve our protection, not our curiosity. And sometimes the most human thing we can do is simply leave them alone. I still leave food in the forest every week, still hear their calls at night, distant but recognizable. And still, after all these years, I feel Magnus placing that enormous hand on my shoulder, Aurora singing in the barn, the infants playing as the sun sets. They were my family, and I was theirs. And that's the only truth that really matters. Not their species, not their biology, but the shared love, the built trust, the intertwined lives through decades of mutual loyalty. I left instructions in my will. The property will be maintained as is for generations. Trust funds will continue to pay for maintenance, for food left at specific points, for protection. Even after I'm gone, even after Aurora is gone, the next generation will have this safe place. And one day, maybe 100 years from now, when humanity has matured enough, when we've learned to share this planet instead of dominating it, this story will be told. And maybe, just maybe, we'll do better. Until then, in the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, a family walks. They know they're remembered. They know they're loved. And they know that as long as there are wild places, as long as there are humans willing to keep secrets, as long as there is love that crosses impossible boundaries, they will survive. If this story touched you, leave your like and share. And remember, not every monster is in the forests. Some are in the mirrors. And the true heroes are those who choose to protect instead of exploit, who choose silence instead of fame, who choose love instead of fear. Magnus taught me that. And now, through this story, he's taught you too.